Why is a simple bag of fruit chews legal in New York but contraband in Vienna? What does the European Union know that the American FDA is refusing to admit? The answer lies in a scandal that has been brewing for nearly 10 years, hidden in plain sight. Welcome to the controversy that is forcing a global reckoning on what we eat. Before you take another bite, you need to know the truth about the Whitener scandal. Subscribe now and comment toxic below if you think food companies should be more transparent. Let's peel back the colorful shell and expose the dark reality inside. The story begins not in a candy factory, but in the sterile labs of industrial chemistry where scientists first isolated titanium dioxide. For over a century, this substance, known scientifically as TO2 and commercially as E171, has been the gold standard for whiteness. It is a naturally occurring oxide of titanium, sourced from minerals like ilmenite, leucozine, and rutile, which are mined from the Earth's crust. Its defining characteristic is its incredibly high refractive index, which means it has a unique ability to scatter light better than almost any other substance known to man. When light hits a particle of titanium dioxide, it doesn't just pass through, it bounces back with intense luminosity, creating a brilliant, blinding white. This property made it indispensable for the paint industry, where covering power and opacity are the primary goals for coating walls and cars. But the utility of this light-scattering mineral did not stay confined to hardware stores and industrial construction sites for very long. Food manufacturers, always in search of ways to make their products more visually arresting, realized that E171 could solve a massive aesthetic problem. When you manufacture a candy, the natural ingredients often result in a dull, translucent, or muddy appearance that is unappealing to the consumer eye. To create the vibrant neon colors that define modern confectionery, the electric lime greens, the radiant yellows, and the deep purples, you first need a blank canvas. Titanium dioxide acts as a primer, a base coat that masks the underlying dullness of the sugar syrup and starch mixture. By adding E171, manufacturers create a bright white shell that serves as the perfect background for artificial dyes, making the colors pop with unnatural intensity. Skittles, the iconic fruit-flavored candy produced by the Mars Wrigley confectionery powerhouse, became the poster child for this chemical usage. The brand's entire marketing identity is built around the concept of the rainbow, a spectrum of vivid colors that promise a burst of flavor and fun. To achieve that signature look, the hard sugar shell of every Skittle was infused with titanium dioxide to ensure the colors were opaque and uniform. Without it, the candies would look somewhat glassy and uneven, lacking the bold, commercial finish that consumers have come to associate with high-quality treats. For decades, this practice went unquestioned, treated as a harmless manufacturing standard approved by food safety agencies around the world. It was listed innocuously on ingredient labels, often buried at the very end in fine print that few parents ever bothered to read. However, as nanotechnology advanced in the early 21st century, the scientific understanding of particle behavior began to shift dramatically. Researchers started to realize that titanium dioxide was not just a single, uniform substance, but a collection of particles of varying sizes. A significant portion of these particles exists on the nanoscale, meaning they are incredibly small, billionths of a meter in diameter. These nanoparticles behave differently than larger particles. They are small enough to bypass the body's natural filtration systems. While a larger particle might pass through the digestive tract harmlessly, a nanoparticle has the potential to cross biological barriers. This realization sparked a wave of concern among toxicologists and health experts in Europe, who began to ask uncomfortable questions. If these particles can cross the intestinal wall, where do they go, and what do they do once they are inside the human body? Early studies in rats suggested that titanium dioxide nanoparticles could accumulate in the liver, spleen, and lungs over time. The body does not have an efficient mechanism for breaking down or excreting these metallic minerals once they are absorbed into the tissue. This accumulation creates a state of chronic exposure, where the substance lingers in the organs long after the candy has been digested. But the most alarming finding was the potential for genotoxicity, a term that strikes fear into the heart of any safety regulator. Genotoxicity refers to the ability of a chemical agent to damage the genetic information within a cell, causing mutations. When DNA is damaged, the cell can die, or worse, it can repair itself incorrectly, leading to the uncontrolled growth that characterizes cancer. The European Food Safety Authority (EFSA), known for its strict adherence to the precautionary principle, decided to launch a full-scale review. The precautionary principle states that if an action or policy has a suspected risk of causing harm to the public, the burden of proof is on the proponents to show it is safe. In other words, in Europe, you must prove a chemical is safe before you use it. You don't wait for proof of harm to ban it. This stands in stark contrast to the regulatory philosophy often seen in other parts of the world, where chemicals remain legal until definitive damage is shown. EFSA's experts spent years analyzing thousands of studies, scrutinizing every piece of data available on E171 and its effects on the biological system. In May 2021, the bombshell dropped. EFSA announced that E171 could no longer be considered safe when used as a food additive. The panel concluded that they could not rule out the concern for genotoxicity, meaning they could not establish a safe daily intake level. There is no safe dose because any amount of DNA damage is theoretically unacceptable when it comes to a purely cosmetic additive. This announcement sent a shockwave through the global food industry, signaling the end of an era for bright white processed foods. The European Commission moved swiftly to turn this scientific opinion into binding law, drafting regulations to ban the substance entirely. By August 2022, the ban was fully enforced across all member states of the European Union, including the strict nation of Austria. In Austria, a country with a deep cultural appreciation for natural foods and stringent agricultural standards, the ban was implemented with rigor. Supermarkets in Vienna, Salzburg, and Graz had to pull non-compliant products from their shelves or force suppliers to send new stock. Mars Wrigley, facing the loss of the massive European market, had no choice but to reformulate Skittles for the EU. They removed titanium dioxide from the European recipe, proving that it was indeed possible to make the candy without the toxin. The result was a Skittle that looked virtually identical to the untrained eye, perhaps slightly less vibrant, but safe for consumption. This created a bizarre dual reality, a safe version of Skittles for Europeans, and a potentially toxic version for everyone else. While Austrian children were munching on reformulated E171 free Skittles, American consumers were still eating the original recipe. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration (FDA) took a completely different stance, maintaining that titanium dioxide was safe. The FDA argued that the studies reviewed by EFSA were not definitive and that the risk to humans at current consumption levels was negligible. They classified titanium dioxide as generally recognized as safe GRAS, permitting its use in foods up to 1% by weight. This regulatory divergence created a confusing landscape where the exact same brand of candy had a completely different chemical profile depending on where you bought it. It highlighted a fundamental disagreement on how to manage risk. Europe chose caution, while the US chose to prioritize market stability and existing precedents. But the story gets darker when you look at the corporate behavior of Mars Wrigley specifically regarding the US market. In February 2016, amidst growing consumer pressure and the early rumblings of the European Scientific Review, Mars made a bold public promise. The company issued a press release stating they would phase out all artificial colors, including titanium dioxide, from their global human food portfolio. They gave themselves a generous timeline of 5 years to complete this transition, assuring customers that they were listening to their concerns. It was a masterclass in public relations, positioning the company as a forward-thinking, health-conscious leader in the confectionery space. News outlets praised the move, and health advocates chalked it up as a victory for the clean label movement. Fast forward to 2021, the 5-year deadline had come and gone, and yet, titanium dioxide remained in American Skittles. The promise had effectively been broken, or at the very least, silently delayed without any public explanation or update. While they had successfully reformulated the product for Europe to comply with the law, they continued to sell the old formula in the US. This hypocrisy did not go unnoticed by consumer protection groups and vigilant individuals who felt betrayed by the company's inaction. The tension reached a boiling point in July 2022, when a California resident named Janelle Thames filed a class action lawsuit. The lawsuit was explosive, alleging that Skittles were unfit for human consumption due to the presence of the known toxin. Thames and his attorneys argued that Mars had failed to warn consumers about the potential health risks associated with E171. They pointed to the broken 2016 pledge as evidence that the company knew about the dangers and simply chose to prioritize profits over safety. The complaint highlighted the fact that safe alternatives existed and were already being used in Europe, making the U.S. inclusion of the chemical unnecessary. Defendant has flouted its own promise to consumers, the lawsuit read, painting a picture of corporate negligence and deceit. The media frenzy that followed was intense, with headlines across the nation asking if Skittles were actually poisonous. It became a viral sensation, with TikTok users and YouTubers conducting their own investigations and reading the ingredient lists on camera. Mars Wrigley defended itself vigorously, stating that they complied with all FDA regulations and that their products were safe. They argued that the lawsuit was based on junk science and that the European ban was an overreaction not supported by U.S. regulators. Legally, they were on solid ground because the FDA, the supreme authority on food safety in the U.S., still allowed the additive. However, the court of public opinion operates by different rules, and the damage to the brand's reputation was becoming significant. The Whitener scandal had exposed the uncomfortable truth that American consumers were being treated as second-class citizens in the safety hierarchy. Why was the health of a child in Vienna valued more highly by the manufacturer than the health of a child in Los Angeles? The lawsuit was eventually voluntarily dismissed later in 2022, but the pressure it generated did not dissipate. It only transformed behind the scenes. The noise from the lawsuit and the passing of state-level bills like the California Food Safety Act kept the heat on. California Assembly Bill 418 originally aimed to ban titanium dioxide specifically, which would have forced a change in the entire U.S. market. Although the chemical was eventually removed from the final version of the bill, the message to the food industry was crystal clear. Legislators were willing to step in where the FDA was lagging, and the risk of a patchwork of state bans was a nightmare for logistics. Mars Wrigley, reading the writing on the wall, began a quiet, unannounced process of reformulation in the United States. By late 2024, and entering into 2025, keen-eyed consumers began to notice a change in the ingredient lists of newly manufactured Skittles packs. The words titanium dioxide were disappearing from the back of the wrappers, replaced by other ingredients, or simply omitted. Mars did not issue a grand press release celebrating this change. They did not want to draw attention to the years of delay. It was a silent reformulation, a strategic retreat designed to eliminate the liability without admitting any past wrongdoing. They swapped the controversial mineral for alternative starches and natural whitening agents that could achieve a similar, if slightly less brilliant, effect. This quiet victory for consumer advocacy proved that pressure works, even against the giants of the food industry. However, the Whitener scandal serves as a cautionary tale that extends far beyond a single bag of colorful candies. It exposes the fragility of the safe, until proven dangerous model that governs much of the American food supply. There are thousands of additives currently approved for use in the U.S. that are banned or severely restricted in other developed nations. Potassium bromate in bread, brominated vegetable oil in sodas, and various red and yellow dyes are all examples of this regulatory disconnect. The Skittles case showed that corporations will often do the bare minimum required by law rather than the maximum required for safety. They will maintain dual supply chains, one clean, one dirty, until the financial or legal cost of the dirty chain becomes too high. The Austrian example demonstrates the power of the precautionary principle in action, prioritizing long-term public health over industrial convenience. It forces us to ask why we accept a system where chemicals are innocent until they leave a trail of evidence behind them. As we move through 2025, the landscape of food is changing, driven by a generation that demands to know exactly what they are eating. Apps that scan barcodes and rate products based on their toxicity are becoming standard tools for the modern shopper. The days of blind trust in the benevolent food giant are over. We are entering the era of the informed and skeptical consumer. Titanium dioxide may be leaving our Skittles, but the question remains, what replaced it, and what else is hiding in the mix? The next time you pick up a package of processed food, flip it over and look at the list of unpronounceable words. Remember that regulations are often decades behind the science, and legality is not always a synonym for safety. The rainbow might be beautiful to look at, but we must ensure that the pot of gold at the end isn't filled with heavy metals. Your health is the one thing that cannot be recalled or reformulated once the damage is done. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop demanding the highest standard for what you put into your body. Because in a world of artificial additives, the most revolutionary act you can commit is to eat real food.